Welcome. Thank you for coming. Special welcome also to our web audiences who will be listening in on what we're saying and watching what we're doing here. Today I want to discuss with you a controversial topic, replacing Darwin, controversial for reasons that I'll explore in a moment. Reasons that include the questions we'll ask and the conclusions we'll reach. So the first question I want to ask is, what would it take to replace Darwin? And by Darwin, I don't mean the man himself, I mean his ideas. So one of his most controversial ideas is that all of life on this planet is related, that you and I are related to one another, but not just to one another, that some of our cousins include the trees outside, the bacteria in this room that you can't even see, the chimpanzees, the great apes, on and on. That's what Darwin says. All of this is related. And Darwin said these relationships arose not by God causing them to be so, but by natural processes over millions of years. That's the idea I'm talking about. What would it take to replace that? And the reason it's controversial, or I should say, one of the reasons I know it's controversial is because reporters usually ask me a question when they find out that I'm a creationist and that I reject this idea. They say, well, you know that 97% of the scientific community disagrees with you. And those statistics are true. If you look at what the Pew Forum has done over many years and surveyed both the general public and the scientific community, the numbers are pretty stark. While in the general public, there tends to be a consistent pocket of creationists. In the scientific community, the numbers are very different. 97% would say evolution is true. So these reporters will say, well, what do you do with that? And they'll give me two options. They say, so if you're a creationist and you want people to believe that too, does that mean we have to either throw out science entirely or say there's some sort of vast conspiracy that 97 out of 100 scientists are somehow hiding the key evidence? So which of these two unpleasant, unpalatable options will you pick? Pick your poison, basically. What do you think the answer is? What options are there? I respond by saying, well, there's a third option. There's more than a third option. There's a fourth and fifth. There are other ways to look at this question, and it may surprise you to know that one of the options comes from perhaps an unlikely source. This isn't the first time we've faced statistics that are this stark. This isn't the first time in history where there's been a scientific consensus and a small group of people challenging it. One of the most recent situations that mirrors this goes back to Darwin himself. When Darwin came along, he didn't come along and be a hero solving a scientific mystery that had been unsolved for centuries. He came along and challenged the scientific consensus. He said so himself in his book. In the first edition that he published in 1859, his book on the origin of species, he preemptively asked a question. He knew his critics were going to ask this question, so he put it in print himself first. Darwin said, why, it may be asked, have all the most eminent living naturalists and geologists rejected this view of the mutability of species? So the mutability is change. In 1859, or pre-1859, people viewed species as unchanging. So Darwin says, why have all the well-known scientists rejected what I have said? And he asked that question so that he could answer it in his book. And he gave four responses. The first response was to review the evidence that he had just given in his book. So this particular sentence I just showed you is in the closing chapter of his book. The first response he gave was to say, well, let's review what I've just covered in the preceding chapters. How could you think any different? That was his first response. The second response, and these get really interesting for me, particularly considering that Darwin lived in Victorian England, he said, let's consider the time scale of human psychology. How long or slow does it take people to alter their view? He said, we are always slow in admitting any great change of which we do not see the intermediate steps. And we all know this is to be true. If there's a dominant idea that we hold to or that someone else holds to, and then the opposite view comes along, people don't quickly switch. You have to create a clear bridge from here to here so that they can walk across it. And even if you can connect these in a series of steps so that they can see, oh, I was wrong, I should be thinking this, they're still slow in doing so. Just look at today's polarized political climate. People aren't trying to talk and find bridges. They're very entrenched. They're very slow in changing their mind. Darwin said the same thing held true back then. So he's proposing something new. People are going to be slow to accept it. His third response, and this is perhaps the most entertaining to me, is to consider the obstinacy of human psychology. This is what Darwin said. I by no means expect to convince experienced naturalists whose minds are stocked with a multitude of facts, all viewed during a long course of years from a point of view directly opposite to mine. In other words, to put it in modern English, some old dogs don't learn new tricks. That's basically what he said, and he got away with it. There are some people who are just not going to change their mind. He wasn't trying to convert them. Instead, he said, I look with confidence to the future, to young and rising naturalists who will be able to view both sides of the question with impartiality. That's what he said, 1859, in response to those who said, well, you're challenging the consensus. How can you do that? The fourth response was to point out the contradictions in the opposing views. And it appears that this four-part strategy was wildly successful. And again, his book bears out this fact. This, again, is the 1859 quote from the first edition of his book. By 1861, this sentence changed as he updated it. He said, Wyatt may be asked, have nearly all the most eminent living naturalists and geologists rejected his view? So by 2 years later, there was already a crack developing in the scientific consensus. And 10 years after the first edition, the 1869 edition, the sentence had changed to this. Wyatt may be asked, until recently, did nearly all the most eminent living naturalists and geologists reject his view. So in 10 years, Darwin flipped the scientific consensus. They totally rejected him in 1859. They embraced him in 1869. So could there be a good basis for challenging the scientific consensus today? I think we can take a page from this strategy. I would argue, first of all, and I'll go backwards through his arguments for a reason I'll explain in a moment, I would say evolution has contradictions. Now, if you don't agree with that, you don't have to take my word for it. I'll just give that a different color on the screen as a proposition to be tested. Has human psychology changed in 150 years? Are people less obstinate today than they were back then? My impression is humans are the same. People are still very, very unlikely to change their views. They take a long time to think of something different. That's helpful. If we flapped in the breeze, so to speak, and went from one thing to another, it'd be a very different existence that we have. What I want to do in the time we have remaining is do what Darwin did, and is review the evidence. Now, I haven't given you a book that we can review, but there's been 150 years since he wrote his book, and I want to review what has happened. So this will be a little bit of a history lesson, some history perhaps that you haven't heard, that I think give us good reason to revisit the question of evolution, good reason to confront the scientific community, the 97%, and say, is it time to replace him? So what I want to do is give you two reasons that I think we have to doubt Darwin, and then at the end talk about why I think we can even go so far as to replace him. So I want to talk about what species are. Darwin wrote a book on the origin of species. If we're going to replace this, we have to have something said about species. I want to talk about what species are, the history of species, and then think deeply about their fundamental nature. And along the way, I think we'll discover some very profound reasons, some very simple but very profound reasons why it's time to rethink this issue, scientifically. So what's a species? I have this textbook, Speciation by Jerry Coyne and Alan Orr, on my desk. Very helpful textbook. It's to evolutionists. Very helpful discussion of what species are, why there are species, and the latest research in that field. And this is many years old, but still a helpful resource. They list 9 different definitions for species. So from the outset, this might seem like a complicated task. I'll make a long story short. The good news is scientists like to get into nitty-gritty details and fight over that, and these 9 definitions aren't that dramatically different. And more towards our purposes, there's a story in this book that is really fascinating. It deals with the peoples of the Papua New Guinea islands in the Southeast Asia, Thailand, Australia, that sort of region. There was a prominent evolutionist, Ernst Mayr. He's now deceased. He was a PhD in ornithology. He liked to study birds. He went to these mountains in the Southeast Asian islands, Papua New Guinea, to study the birds of that region. And so he went in to formally, as scientists do, classify, this is a bird species, or here's another bird species, and this group looks different from this group, so there's another bird species. He tallied them, he cataloged them. He came up with 137 bird species for that region. Now, he went in as an explorer, as a scientist, to study what's there. The native peoples of that region don't have the formal scientific training that Ernst Mayr did. He was at the Harvard Museum for a while. They aren't formally trained, and this is what a species is, and here's the scientific definition, and here's the tools that you use to explore them. Instead, they, like all of us, just notice the world around them. You could probably tell me what are the native species wherever you live. You're probably from many different states, and you could tell me, yeah, this is what I see in my backyard. Here's what comes to the bird feeder. That just happens naturally. Well, these peoples of Papua New Guinea, in their own language, observed the world around them and then gave names to what they saw. So they observed the birds around them, and that bird is red or yellow or has a different song than this bird over here, and they'll give different names. So Ernst Mayr, PhD, came up with 137 species. How many names do you think the native peoples had for the birds of their region? Any guesses? 137 is close. 136. So I suppose you could conclude that you don't need a PhD to do science. You could also conclude, and I think this is the more important conclusion right now for our purposes, species are intuitively obvious. What is a species? It's something we all recognize. We can see, oh, that's a creature that's different from that creature, and that's something different. If the native peoples can see enough differences where they apply different names, species are intuitively obvious. So, to get to our 2 reasons to doubt Darwin, I want to make a series of observations and basically derive from understanding what species are and their history and their fundamental nature, derive these reasons. So the first observation, species are intuitively obvious. We're not dealing with a terribly complex topic. It's something we can all recognize. Well, what's the history? And here is where I want to focus now on the history of the formal scientific term. When we're discussing the origin of species in a scientific sense, this question, this debate only goes back a few hundred years. Humans have been naming what they see, exploring what we see for as long as we've been on this planet. But in terms of the formal scientific sense, when I use the term species as a scientist, I'm using something that has a recent history. It goes back to Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish biologist, who was, even by evolutionists, is considered the father of modern taxonomy, the father of modern classification. He began a catalog called Systema Naturae, in which he documented the species that he was aware of. He updated this as he discovered more and more. 1758 is the 10th edition. Many scientists view this as a landmark study, sort of the beginning then of what we understand as the formal study of this concept. Now, what I want to do is a little scientific experiment and to see and test whether what I just told you is true. Are species intuitively obvious? So I'm going to walk through some of the species on Linnaeus' list so we get a sense for what he knew versus what we now know today. But I need you to help me, and you need to tell me what the species are on the screen and tell me if these are indeed intuitively obvious. So, tell me what this species is. Zebra, okay, intuitively obvious. Good so far. Another thing Linnaeus gave us is what we call the binomial classification system, this system where we give 2 names to every species. So we humans, in the formal scientific sense, have a binomial name, Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus name, sapiens is a species name. And that holds true, that's the same the system for animals. This moose has the genus name Alsace, species name Alsace, so we have a different genus and species name, sometimes species have the same. Alsace, Alsace. Back to our little experiment. What species is this? And in the formal scientific sense, bison, bison. And in the formal sense, Panthera leo. Okay, keep going. Red fox specifically, yes. A little bit trickier, this is a monkey. It's specifically a Barbary macaque. These were all on Linnaeus' list, and there's a reason I went through this kindergarten exercise, because it has profound ramifications for our study. So, you could make a nice zoo with the mammals that Linnaeus knew of in 1758. In total, so everything I just showed you, would be classified as mammals. They suckle their young. This characteristic, we suckle our young, among other characteristics, classifies these species as mammals. In total, Linnaeus knew of less than 200 mammal species. Well, what's the significance of that? Anyone want to guess how many mammal species in 2017 the scientific community recognizes? How many today? A lot, that's a good answer. Over 5,400. So that's a dramatic increase in just a few hundred years. Less than 200 in 1758, 2017, several thousand. So what changed? What happened that we've had this explosion in biological knowledge? One of the things that's changed since 1758 is scientists now lump domestic creatures, horses, donkeys, so forth, in the same category as wild species. So domestic horses are now lumped in the wild horse species, domestic donkeys in the wild donkey species. Okay, that's one thing that's changed. That actually reduces the number of species, it doesn't increase it. The way we've increased the number of species, one of the ways is by discovering more versions of what we already knew. More versions of zebras, more versions of horses, more versions of donkeys or asses. Here's the members of the family, the horse, zebra, donkey family that are recognized today, 7 of them. You can see across the top of the screen, there are 3 zebra species. On the bottom, the 3 tan species. The one on the far left is the Przewalski's horse. That's the wild species. It actually went extinct in the wild. It's been reintroduced. All the horses that you see on ranches and farms belong to that species. They're domesticated. They are lumped into the wild one. In the middle are the 2 Asian wild ass species, the Kiang and the Onager. And on the right, the one with stripes on its legs. How many of you have seen a striped donkey before? Just a few. It is the African wild ass species, so it's in the Eritrea, Ethiopia region. Domestic donkeys are part of that species. And just to make it clear that these are indeed different species, I'll show you the differences among the various zebra species. This is the plain zebra. It has fairly broad stripes that are almost horizontal on its haunches. Notice as well that the stripes go all the way around its belly. There's no stopping, any gap. This guy's looking at the camera so you can see its nose that's black, and it transitions immediately into stripes on its face. Those features distinguish it from the mountain zebra. Notice that the stripes are thinner and denser. There aren't as many of the horizontal, broad stripes on its haunches, and they don't reach all the way up the backside. There's a gridiron-type pattern on its backside. Notice the stripes don't cross the belly. There's a white patch there. You can kind of see on the side view of this guy's face that there's a black nose that transitions to brown and then to stripes. You could see it better if he was looking at the camera. It's also got a dewlap on its neck. This makes it different, again, from the plain zebra, in this case, the imperial zebra species. I think it's the prettiest. Notice that on its haunches, it basically has no broad stripes. They're all fairly dense. There's this swirl pattern. The stripes do not cross the belly. Doesn't have that dewlap. The nose is black to brown, and if it was looking at the camera, you could see a patch of white. So these are the features that distinguish the species. I've shown you 3 individuals. This is true of populations. So when you find an imperial zebra, it looks like this. When you find a mountain zebra, not all of them have the dewlap, but they have that pattern, the gridiron on their back. They have the particular nose striping pattern with the black and brown and stripes. These are characteristic features. That's what defines them. We've discovered more of them since Linnaeus. We've discovered more versions of species like elephants. This is the Asian elephant. It's got that characteristic skull shape. It's got the smaller ears, very different from the large ears of the African elephant. Skull shape is different. Giraffe, many scientists still consider there to be only one species. There's been debate recently based on genetics as to whether there's 1 or 4, but let's just say there's 1. This giraffe species belongs to a family that includes one other species, one that was not on Linnaeus's list, but's been discovered since then. This particular species doesn't have a neck that's as long as a giraffe. It is a mammal. Anyone guess what other species has been discovered and now placed in the giraffe family? Okapi, very good. So this guy, mahogany coat, stripes on its back, part of the same family as the giraffe. Now, why would they be lumped the same? Now, when I look at a giraffe, I get pretty distracted by its long neck. I don't typically notice those horns, or in the technical scientific sense, the ossicones on the top of its head. The male okapi has those as well. One of the features that includes it in this particular family. Why was the okapi not on Linnaeus's list? It exists today, native only to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or Zaire. I mentioned that Linnaeus was a European, a Swede. When did Europeans first penetrate the African interior such that they could discover this creature? David Livingstone was one of the pioneers, early pioneers. He wasn't born until 1813. So, of course, he has to grow up before he can make his trip. 1813 is over 50 years after Linnaeus' 10th edition. So history plays a role. The globe as we know it today is really a recent discovery. We take for granted how much we know about the globe and the various continents and the species on it. Not so well known in 1758. History plays a role in the absence of other types of mammals like kangaroos, marsupials, those that have creatures in the pouch. Why are marsupials absent? Well, Australia, at least the Australian marsupials, weren't discovered by Europeans, James Cook namely, until 1770. So no kangaroos, no wombats, no sugar gliders, no koalas. All these various marsupial species native to these regions, no Tasmanian devils, absent from Linnaeus' list because he doesn't even know Australia exists. Other types of mammals that lay eggs include the platypus and the echidna, even though it looks like a porcupine, very different reproductive system. So all of these were missing from Linnaeus' list for now we can recognize as obvious historical reasons. But the discovery of Australia only modestly increases the number of species. 250 species added to the list with that discovery. That doesn't get us anywhere close to 5,400. So how did we go from less than 200 to over 5,400 today, and what does this have to do with Darwin? The major contributors to the large number of mammal species that we know today are really due to only a few categories. Shrews, moles, bats, rodents like rats and mice. And you can understand why these guys would have been missing from Linnaeus' list. If there's an elephant roaming around the world, we recognize it pretty quick because it's big and large and it's hard to miss. Giraffes is hard to miss. How many of us easily miss? How many of us wish we would miss the mice that are scurrying around the floor, outside? These sorts of rodents, they're small, hard to identify, and so you're trying to map out all the species that exist in a region. It takes a fair amount of effort to cover every plot of ground where these guys might be, or in case of bats, looking through the trees, the air, so forth. These guys alone contribute over 3,700 species. So as you go to sleep tonight, you can think about the fact that there's over 3,700 species of mice and rats and bats roaming this globe, looking to terrorize us. So 1758, less than 200 species. Today, over 5,400. What does this have to do with Darwin? Well, I just gave you a timeline, 1758, 2017. That's a huge increase. Darwin falls somewhere in here. But let's just document here our second observation. Number of species has grown dramatically. Darwin is 1858, just 100 years after Linnaeus, and he knew of less than 1,800 mammal species. That's only a third of what we know today. Okay, knowledge has increased. What's the big deal? I've used mammals as a representative example, but in terms of all the species that exist on the planet, mammals are a tiny fraction. I didn't even tell you about plant species like this giant sequoia, or fungal species like this pink oyster mushroom. Mammals are a category of a larger inclusive group we call vertebrates. We have a backbone, so we're vertebrates, classified as vertebrates. There's all sorts of animals that are invertebrates, like this mollusk, this giant clam. Octopi are also classified as mollusks, same category as shellfish, surprisingly, blue-ringed octopus. In the oceans, there are vertebrates, some of which have bony skeletons, some of which have cartilaginous skeletons, like sharks and rays. In this case, this is a manta ray. Bony skeletons vertebrates include this pufferfish. On the land, there's mammals that are vertebrates, there's amphibians that are vertebrates. This is not a reptile, it's not a worm. It's a caecilian, same group of creatures as frogs and salamanders. Not a well-known species. Birds, obviously, vertebrates. They're familiar invertebrates like the honeybee. Anyone know how many species in total, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, the whole 9 yards, how many species in total do scientists recognize today, 2017? A lot, that's a good answer. 150,000, it's getting closer. 1.6 million, over 1.6 million. So there's a tremendous diversity of life. We're thinking about origins. What did Darwin know in 1859? Here's a graph. The gray line represents how the number of species that we recognize formally has grown with time. The horizontal axis is a timeline. The vertical axis is the number of species, so you can see as that gray line goes up, the number of species increases with time. Darwin's year, 1859, shows up right there. You can see very little was known. This is a paper from 2011, so they use slightly different methodologies than what I just discussed, and it's a few years ago. So They are not up to 1.6 million, but there's a lot of species there. Notice that there's a big gap between the orange line and the blue line. That's how much our knowledge has grown in 150 years. By my estimates, Darwin knew of less than 15% of what we know today. So think about that. Darwin's writing a book that many consider the Bible on the origin of species, but his subject matter, species, he knows less than 15%. And we can make that even stronger. See how this line goes up. This paper estimated that the number of known species actually alive on the planet, because that line suggests we're going to keep discovering them, is probably closer to 10 million. In other words, today, 2017, we probably know of less than 20% of what actually exists, which means Darwin knows of an even smaller fraction. So Darwin's writing a book on species, yet he is unaware of the existence of over 85% of them. Should we trust his conclusions? Darwin worked with the data that he had. We work with the data that we have today. Would it be reasonable to call it case closed? Let's say we're dealing with a different historical question, not the origin of species, but let's say JFK's assassination. I lived in Dallas for 6 years, been to the museums. This is a question near and dear to my heart. Let's say I came to you and I said, I've got the explanation for who shot JFK. And the answer is not Lee Harvey Oswald. You might say, well, okay, you can think whatever you want to. What's your evidence? And I say, well, I only looked at 15%. You might say, well, talk to me when you finish your investigation. You might come to me and say, let's reverse roles. You might come to me and say, well, Lee Harvey Oswald shot JFK. This is settled science. The Warren Commission solved this in 1964. And then I came back to you and I said, well, did you know that the Warren Commission had only 15% of the evidence? You might rethink it. Should we rethink it when the question is the origin of species and the numbers are the same? That's my first reason. The first reason I think we have good grounds for revisiting this issue and seeing if what Darwin thought then still holds true today. We have much more evidence. So that's the history of species. I want to dig a little bit more deeply now into what species actually are and how Darwin was able to overturn the scientific consensus. So let's go back, not to Darwin, but to 1758. Here's a species that Linnaeus was aware of. This was on his list. This is the Arctic fox. What's the first thing you notice about this particular species? Bright white fur coat. So this is very helpful to our eyes, camouflages it against the snowy white Arctic environment. That thick coat insulates it against the frigid cold. We now know of other species that have these same characteristics that help it survive, thrive in this Arctic environment. The polar bear, documented 1774, has a white coat, helps it blend in, insulation. And it's not just predators, but also prey that have these features. The Arctic hare, 1819, has bright white coat, helps it blend in, and insulates it in this frigid environment. So let's say you're Linnaeus. You take a trip to the Arctic, you're aware of the Arctic fox, you want to go around the globe and document what you see. So you start up north, and the only way you can go from north is south. So you start looking for foxes, bears, hares, rabbits elsewhere. And let's say you go from the Arctic down to Europe and Asia. You'll find foxes, but not Arctic foxes. You'll find red foxes. What purpose might this red coat serve? And to help you answer this question, how many red foxes do you see in this diagram? Someone said, well, there's a reflection there. There's a fox looking up at the one. Well, obviously, that's just a reflection, not a second individual right there. There's two. There's another one up here, but you have to look carefully. What's the point? The point is this coat seems to help camouflage in this particular environment. So that's Europe and Asia. Let's say you go back to the Arctic, you want to look for bears, and you go south, but this time to North America. You'll find bears, not polar bears, but black bears. How many black bears do you see in this particular image? It's really kind of a trick question because I only see one. I just wanted to see if you could find something else. But it helps it blend in, much better than if it had a white coat. If you keep going south, you're looking for rabbits. You go to the deserts, you'll find jackrabbits. What's the first thing you notice about this particular jackrabbit species? Big old ears. So this guy has a challenge of extreme temperature, but the opposite extreme that the Arctic hare face. So not extreme cold, but extreme heat. This guy has to stay cool and get rid of its body heat. And the way it does that, One of the ways it does that is these large ears through which there's a lot of circulation, helps radiate out this body heat, stay cool. So wherever you go, you find species that seem to fit their environments. Linnaeus could have made these observations. Now let me ask you a question. Let's say biotechnology advanced to such an extent that we could now design species from scratch. I go to you and I say, I want 2 foxes. I want you to design for me 2 foxes. One's got to thrive in the Arctic, one's got to thrive in a more temperate climate. How would you design it? And would you design it much different from what you see here? Would you design an Arctic fox with a red coat, a blue coat? I don't think you design it much different than what you see here. It seems like these guys were designed for the environments in which they exist. Same is true of the bears, same is true of the rabbits. We've looked at some extreme environments, even in less extreme environments, like the tropics of Africa, the tropical savanna, zebras exist. Scientists debate precisely what these stripes do, but to our eyes, again, it seems to serve some protective camouflage effect. Wherever you go, around the globe, Europe, North America, Africa, Asia, you find species that seem to fit their environments, as if they were designed by some master designer for that environment. That was the dominant idea. That was the scientific consensus of the days before Darwin wrote his book. So how could Darwin overturn this idea? When Darwin said, yes, I know that everyone disagrees with me, all the most eminent biologists, naturalists reject what I say, what's the evidence that he's reviewing? Not only did the number of species increase, 1758 to 1859, but the knowledge, fields of science, and knowledge in those fields of science increased. The world expanded. David Livingstone penetrates Africa. We know more about the globe. They discover Australia. Darwin says, well, let's think about the new geographical data that we possess. This is the type of argument he would have made. So I've shown here one of the 3 zebra species, but I'm showing in red the geographic locations of all 3 zebra species. They're indigenous, native only to Africa, from South Africa up to near Ethiopia. That's where you find them in the wild today, and only there. And they seem to fit, they seem to be designed for this tropical savanna environment, that sort of thing, where they can blend in. Darwin comes along and says, okay, I'll concede that point. They do look like they're designed for that environment. But Africa is not the only location where we find these tropical savannas. You can find them, and I've shown them here on the screen with red stars, in northern India on the border with Nepal. You can find them in northern Australia. You can find them in Brazil. You can find more temperate grasslands in the United States. Go to the Great Plains, go to Nebraska, go to Kansas. You won't find zebras there. You won't find zebras native to Brazil or to Asia or to Australia. That was Darwin's question then. Why, if zebras were designed for Africa, if zebras were designed for the savanna, why don't you find them in every place you find a savanna? If the designer took such great pains to make them for this environment, why didn't he put them in every instance of that environment? That was Darwin's challenge. That was one of the fields of science that he drew on, geography, biogeography. Another field was anatomy and physiology. So if you were to take your forearm, strip away the skin and hair and muscle and nerves and blood all the way down to the bone, it looks something like this on the left. And it's been color-coded so that you can see the order of the bones. 1 in tan, 2 bones in red and white, and then in the wrists you have the in yellow bones, and then the fingers. And it's color-coded for a reason. The 4 limbs of the other species that are shown here on the screen, there are 4 limbs, are a dog, bird, and whale. They also have 1, 2 wrist bones, fingers, but obviously very different. The whale bone is much shorter. Obviously the bird fingers are much different than our fingers. There's obvious differences, and Darwin would have said, yes, there's obvious differences in what you see here. But there's an underlying shared pattern. 1, 2, wrists, fingers. In every case, the human, dog, bird, whale, same pattern. 1, 2, wrists, fingers. And evolutionists make this argument to this day, and they say, if you were designing a forelimb from scratch, there's 1,000 different ways you could do it. Why is it that when we look to biology, we find this one pattern, or a small set of patterns? Darwin said the only explanation must be these guys inherited this pattern from a common ancestor that had the 1, 2, wrists, fingers pattern. So he drew on that field. He drew on the field of embryology. Here's a diagram that's actually in a book I've published. It's not one of Ernst Haeckel's fake diagrams of embryological development. This is try to make it as close as possible to reality. These are 5 very different species, from left to right: turtle, frog, mouse, chicken, zebrafish. And I've shown you different developmental stages. So the bottom row represents the early, probably shortly post-conception stage in these various species. The middle row is a later stage, or middle stage, I should say, the Pharyngula stage. And the late stage is up top. And by the late stage, it becomes fairly obvious what's what. No one's going to confuse which one's the turtle and which one's something else. You can already see in the chicken the beak forming, the early wings forming. The mouse embryo, the late stage in the middle, looks like a mouse. The frog tadpole stage is apparent. You can see the zebrafish stage. So there's differences at the late, differences early. The Pharyngula stage is where there's a question. So look at that first column on the left, the turtle column, compare it to the chicken column. The Pharyngula stage in particular, that middle row. They're almost identical. It's very hard to distinguish them. If I showed you these two and you didn't know anything about what was going on, I just identify what species this is, I'd have trouble doing it. Darwin would have asked, why is that? Why is there similarity? You can design the developmental program any which way you want to. Why is there this similarity? Must be due to common ancestry, that all of life is connected and they've inherited things from these ancestors. Another field of science, embryology. Fourth field of science, paleontology, fossils. Darwin recognized this as a problem in his day, said, well, I hope we'll find these transitional forms, creatures that blend the features of 2 very different species. Today, evolutionists would say, well, we found them. This is Tiktaalik, published 2005, 2006. It seems to blend the features of fish and land species. It has scales like a fish, a head like an amphibian or a reptile, and limbs that look like half fins, half legs. Seems like the perfect connection between oceanic creatures and land creatures, as if life evolved from the oceans onto the land. That's what Darwin would have said had he had this evidence available to him. So there's history bringing you up to 1859, how Darwin was able to overturn the scientific consensus of his day. That's some of the evidence he would have reviewed in his book that he would have used to try to persuade his readers, and his conclusion was case closed. And that's been the conclusion of the scientific community for the last 150 years, and remains that conclusion. 97% of them would say that settles it. I wanted to think more deeply about species, is what I said, and to do so, I wanted to give you that background so that you could see what Darwin used and what he didn't. So there's a field of science, a critical field of science, that's missing from this list. And I want to explore that. And we're going to do that by going back to what we just discussed, the idea that species are intuitively obvious. We recognize species like that. You all passed the test we did earlier. You said, I showed you this, and you said zebra. Well, let's think deeply about this. Why, when I show you this image, do you immediately say zebra? What is it about this guy that immediately tells you this is zebra? Stripes, obviously. I show you this image, you immediately say giraffe. And why do you say giraffe? Long neck, characteristic feature. I show you this, you say elephant because trunk, large size, the ears, and you can immediately distinguish Asian from African because based on its features. I show you this image, you say jaguar because why? Spots or rosettes. That's at least what I read at the Fort Worth Zoo. I'm not sure the male jaguars appreciate those being called rosettes, but so they're named. I show you this image, you say tiger because stripes. Species are defined by their traits. That's how we recognize them. That's why it's intuitively obvious. They have these features that are characteristic. Now, there's something about these traits that we've taken for granted in this entire discussion. What defines those traits? Well, those traits are inherited consistently from generation to generation. Zebras produce more zebras. And it's species specific. Plains zebras produce plains zebras, not mountain zebras or imperial zebras. African elephants produce not just more elephants, but more African elephants, not Asian elephants. So species are defined by those traits. Traits are defined by inheritance, and they have to be, otherwise we wouldn't even have this discussion. If an elephant in one generation could give birth to a spider, and then in the next generation that spider gave birth to a snake, and the next generation that snake gave birth to a fish, and then to an insect, and there was massive change every generation, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. We wouldn't have the term species in our dictionaries. Because those traits are defined by inheritance that are consistent from generation to generation, we can have this discussion and are having this discussion. So I'm trying to connect some dots here as we think about what species actually are. They're defined by traits, but traits are defined by inheritance. Well, what defines inheritance, and how would Darwin have answered that question in 1859? He would have come to me and said, I've got the answer for the origin of the tiger species. Okay. Tell me, Darwin, what is the origin of the orange fur and the stripes? Well, inheritance. Well, tell me, Darwin, what about inheritance tells you that it's going to be a tiger and that it's going to show up in this particular species and not in this species? How do you answer those questions? How could he have answered those questions? Why don't we try to answer those questions? Here's the tiger. It's got traits that define it. Those traits are defined by inheritance. Are there any other species that have orangish, reddish hair? There might be some in this room that have orangish, reddish hair. Humans also have it. And there's a set of traits that typically are accompanied by this. So who typically has red hair? Pale skin, freckles. There's a set of features that defines redheads. Some might say temper, but there are features that define redheads. And what's interesting is it's not just Europeans that have natural red hair. Now, I'm not referring to people who dye their hair red. I'm saying natural red hair. There are Central Asians who have natural red hair. This is a child from Western China near Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. Natural red hair. So we're trying to understand the origin of traits, the origin that tigers red hair, humans red hair, yet there's a global distribution that maybe doesn't make immediate sense when you look at it. If we keep going further east, you will find natural red hair in the peoples of Papua New Guinea. That individual on the left, natural red hair. And look, on the right, individual natural blonde hair. If you didn't have their hair color, you might say, well, they look kind of like they have African features, yet red hair, blonde hair. Where did that come from? What defines who has certain features, traits, and who doesn't? And you have to be able to answer that question to be able to answer the question of the origin of these species. Well, that's global distribution. Let's focus in on just individual families to see if we can even explain that. So there's some families where one parent has red hair and the other parent doesn't. So in this case, I'm showing you a family. Dad has dark hair, mom has red hair, and every single one of her daughters has red hair as well. Why is that? Can we predict when children have red hair and when they don't? There are families where dad has dark hair, mom has red hair, and none of the children have red hair. Why is that? How do you explain that? What predicts who gets red hair and who doesn't? Does it just appear and disappear at random? Could it be other colors that eventually appear? Could humans eventually have blue hair? That's a legitimate question without the knowledge of inheritance. I've talked about hair color. We can talk about hair quantity. Is there a time, do we know what defines a lot of hair or a little hair? Could we eventually have a lot of hair? Did our ancestors have a lot of hair? That's a real question when we're talking about evolution, because they would say that our ancestors did, at least those with whom we share a close genealogical relationship. Tigers, humans have red hair. We already looked at a species that has red hair as well. Another one, foxes, red foxes, orangutans have red hair. What defines when red hair shows up and when it doesn't? If orangutans and humans have red hair, does that mean we have a common ancestor? When does red hair show up? When does it not? And why? There's a lot of puzzles and paradoxes when you start thinking more deeply about inheritance. Now that we have microscopes, those paradoxes increase. So I'm going to show you, this is a 10-day-old embryo, and I want you to tell me what species that embryo belongs to. Any guesses? Someone said any of them. That's a good guess. Any brave souls want to say, I know what that is? Or take a shot in the dark at it? This isn't a test where you get a reward or a punishment, just any guesses. A fish? Okay, that's a good guess. Whale? Okay. Turtle? Okay, all good guesses. Let me give you some days later another image of this embryo. This is a 30-day-old embryo. Does this change your opinion slightly? Human, seal, okay. Frog, answers all over the map. Now I'm going to show you day 65, and you'll probably have a good guess by this point. So you can see the hooves, the head, the tail. You zoom in, that's day 85. Now if I showed you the image at birth, there'd be no debate. It's a horse embryo. So at birth, by and large, species are immediately recognizable. I show you a zebra at birth, and immediately it's a zebra. No questions. So species are defined by traits, but all those traits that define us, that define zebras, that define horses, get completely erased at conception and rebuilt every generation. So we want to know the origin of red hair. That's what we're discussing. There are really much bigger questions that have to be answered. We're trying to figure out, why does red hair show up and not? Well, everything that defines our features gets erased and rebuilt every generation. So species are defined by traits, traits by inheritance, and inheritance is a whole bunch of paradoxes. Back to Darwin. What did he know? Those paradoxes were not resolved. The first steps towards resolving those paradoxes were not taken until a few years after Darwin published his work. 1865, 1866 is where most genetics textbooks begin. Gregor Mendel's experiments, not with human family trees, but with a common household garden plant, pea plant. Like today, back then, Mendel could have obtained pure breeding plants. Farmers will use peas, will harvest peas. Farmers want crops that produce a consistent outcome every generation. My grandfather was a strawberry farmer. They were delicious strawberries, I can tell you, especially with sugar after dinner. And his customers greatly appreciated his strawberries. Now, strawberries are a seasonal crop, which means you can only sell them certain times of the year. Well, he's got to make money the whole year, so what he did in off-season, at least the German off-season, was to purchase strawberries from elsewhere and sell them. And that didn't always go so well, it didn't go over so well with his customers. These aren't your strawberries. And there was a difference. There was a blander taste. He had a particular strain that just had a delicious flavor. Farmers want pure breeding crops. So that was true back then, that's true today. Mendel could have obtained pure breeding pea plants, those that gave a consistent outcome. In this case, we're looking at the color of the peas. He could get pure breeding yellow peas, pure breeding green-seeded pea plants. So if you just keep self-fertilizing them, same outcome, same outcome. If you cross them, which is what Mendel did, he did hundreds of crosses, counted thousands of peas, he discovered something very interesting. So doing that experiment, yellow with green, all of the offspring, the F1 generation, first filial generation, were yellow. No mix of the two, no green whatsoever, not yellowish green, just yellow. So this was his first observation, first conclusion. Mendel concluded that inheritance must be defined by unit factors. That's the term he came up with. What other term is there? There's something that's quantifiable, something that's distinct and discrete. It's not yellowish green, it's either yellow or green, and when you cross them, only yellow. There's some factor that encodes that. That doesn't answer all of our questions, though. You immediately see and begin to, if you look at this result and you say, well, what happened to green? Did it get destroyed? If that green pea plant was the last living green plant on the planet, did he just make it go extinct? Well, he self-fertilized the F1 generation and was able to recover green. And so this was his second inference. Green wasn't destroyed, it was hidden. These unit factors, whatever they are, the genetic information, whatever defines inheritance, can be hidden. In this case, yellow was dominant. When yellow and green are crossed, green is still present in those offspring, it's just hidden. When green and yellow occur together, yellow dominates green, green is recessive. And this occurred in very specific mathematical ratios. When he self-fertilized those F1s, 1/4 of the time, 25%, the offspring were green, 3/4, 75% were yellow in the F2 generation. Well, what does that mean? He took this experiment one step further. He took those F2 plants, self-fertilized them, and I've got lines going down the screen so you can follow to the next slide, the outcomes. I've got this large diamond with the individual diamonds in there so you can see them, follow the green. When he self-fertilized those behaved as if they were pure breeding green. Always green, next generation, always green, always green. The yellow ones came in a couple different varieties. Look at the blue shaded diamond, follow that yellow pea plant. When he self-fertilized 1/3 of his F2 yellow plants, they acted like pure breeding yellow, only yellow, only yellow. 2/3, the peach shaded boxes, gave rise to that same F2 result, 3-to-1 ratio. Without going into the details of the math, what Mendel inferred, the only way he could make sense of these results, was to postulate that the unit factors for yellow and for green, where there was dominance and recessive, they must have segregated from one another. There were other experiments that Mendel did For our purposes, this explains why red hair behaves in the manner that it does. Red hair is a recessive trait. It's encoded by recessive unit factors. So the only way it shows up is if both unit factors in a particular individual, in this case mom, say red. And mom is going to pass on one unit factor to offspring, dad is going to pass on another. If dad has no red unit factors, none of the offspring will have red hair. Red will be silent. It'll be hidden, just like green was in the F1 generation. In the family where mom had red hair and every single one of her daughters had red hair, dad must have had a unit factor for red. Well, his hair wasn't red. That's because it was in hidden form. Dad must have had something that says non-red and red. This is going to dominate red, and so he passes on that red to his offspring. Mom is always going to pass on only red, and hence the redheaded daughters. Those were the first steps taken towards understanding what defines inheritance, and it was taken after Darwin. Mendel's results were lost then for several decades, rediscovered around the turn of the century, and I'm going to zoom through this history really fast. Scientists began to look at sperm and egg, these cells that define inheritance. That's what gets passed on. They connected Mendel's principles to structures in these cells, chromosomes. We have chromosomes in our cells, 46 of them. This is an actual image of it, 23 pairs. This is what encodes then. This is what the scientists concluded then. This is what defines red hair. 10 fingers, a head, 10 toes, 2 legs, so forth. This is where the tiger's stripes are encoded in the tiger chromosomes. That was only a partial answer, though, to this question, because chemically, chromosomes are made of two major chemical molecules, DNA and protein. The DNA is shown in that twisted ladder-like structure. The proteins are showed by those yellowish plugs. And for many years, scientists thought it was proteins, not DNA, that were the substance of heredity. It took many decades for this debate to be resolved. It wasn't resolved until Watson and Crick in 1953, and among others, discovered the structure of DNA that I just told you about. This was unknown before then. They solved it. And it was at that point that the scientific community finally settled on and resolved this question. Yes, it's DNA. DNA must be where, in some coded form, because this is a chemical, not a book of English instructions, there must be something that says red hair, tiger stripes, orangutan fur, so forth. Orangutan hair. This is where it's encoded. This is also not the end of the story, because once you settle on DNA as the substance of heredity, now the question is, well, what is it? What is the code in us that says human? What is the code in that 10-day-old horse embryo that says you're going to take this sphere and sculpt 4 legs and a tail and a head that looks like a horse and eventually the coat color and so forth? What is it about DNA that does that? And to answer that question, you've got to get the actual sequence. So that began a new long study, and again, I'm zooming through this history fast. You can see this timeline here on the horizontal axis. The first time point is Darwin, 1859. 1953 is the structure of DNA. Nearly 100 years after Darwin publishes his work, DNA is recognized as the substance of heredity. Late 60s, the first DNA sequences were solved from viruses by and large, because they have the smallest DNA sequences, the easiest technology-derived science. It wasn't until 1997 that these databases finally passed the 1 million mark. That doesn't mean we have the DNA sequence from all 1.6 million species. Far from it. What it means is we have a few select creatures, a few select species with a lot of sequences. So humans have tens of thousands of DNA sequences in our public databases. E. coli has countless. So we're still trying to get the DNA sequences from the creatures around the globe. My point is, using 1997 as the landmark, for most of the last 150 years, highlighted in red, we've had no genetic information. Species are defined by traits. Traits are defined by inheritance. It's DNA that defines inheritance. You want to know the origin of species, you've got to know the origin of the DNA that defines them. Darwin couldn't do it. No one could do it until now. Darwin took a massive scientific risk, and he admitted as much. Chapter 5, the summary section of his book, says our ignorance of the laws of variation is profound. A critic might say, well, he doesn't use the term genetics. True. That's because the term genetics wasn't invented until the early 1900s. That's how primitive the knowledge of genetics was in 1859. What I've just told you isn't necessarily a bombshell. It has bombshell implications for the origins debate, but the evolutionists have basically conceded what I've just said. Dennis Venema is an evolutionist who wrote a book, Adam and the Genome, to argue against the idea that Adam and Eve actually existed. He used genetic data. He made this statement in his book, page 41. Darwin, like all biologists of his day, save Gregor Mendel, who was working in isolation and essentially unknown, these are all things we just looked at, Darwin was confused about how heredity worked. Genetics, DNA sequencing, and comparing whole genomes. Genomes is just the totality of the DNA sequence. Our genome is the entirety of the instructions for 10 fingers, 10 toes, so forth. Comparing the entirety of the instructions between species have thus been a great boon to evolutionary science. That's Venom's conclusion. But they have also been potentially a great threat. Evolution as a theory could have been completely upended by these scientific advances. Venom would say, but of course they haven't. This is the sentence I want you to see, though. So if evolution could have been completely upended by genetics, what does that say about the fossil record and the data that Darwin had from geography and from anatomy and physiology and from embryology? If you were looking at the way this issue has been presented, it seems to have been presented like settled science for 150 years, and there was no overturning it. Yet this quote says, there was a big looming risk hanging and waiting to be resolved with the advent of modern genetics. So species are defined by traits, traits defined by inheritance. Inheritance is a whole bunch of paradoxes that weren't solved until long after Darwin, and some of them are still being worked on. You want to know the origin of the human species and of red hair? DNA is where the answer lies. You want to know the origin of the tiger species? DNA is where the answer lies. The answer to the children's question, how did the zebra get stripes? The answer is found in DNA. Species are defined by traits, traits by inheritance, and it's DNA that defines inheritance, a concept that wasn't recognized until long after Darwin died. So why would Darwin write a book on the origin of species long before anyone would have the direct data to answer that? Think about it. If we knew nothing about anatomy, nothing about cadavers, let's say no one had ever cracked open a dead person's body to look at what's inside, could we have an intelligent discussion of the digestive system, of the immune system, of the nervous system, of how muscles work? I don't think so. You really have to go way back in time to think, well, no one ever opened a cadaver? Well, that's basically what I'm saying. How could you answer any questions about our physiology without actually opening a body? How could we have an intelligent discussion about E. coli, about microbes, before the invention of the microscope? Could we talk about it in any intelligent way? Can we talk about the origin of species without any genetic data? That's the challenge. So I've given you two reasons why I think it's time to doubt Darwin. He knew less than 15% of his subject matter. That's just the way science was in that day. Today, we probably know less than 20% of what's out there. And he tried to answer a fundamentally genetic question without any genetic data. So what I've just said is reasons to say, let's look at this question again. I haven't given you reasons necessarily to replace Darwin. We can't do that in 60 minutes. I've written a book, though, that I think gets into much more detail. So I've told you that the evolutionists concede that, yes, this is fundamentally a genetic question. Why aren't the 97% being converted? That's what I deal with in part 2. Part 1, I've basically given you the introduction to this book in part 1. Part 2 deals with what was it about geography, anatomy, embryology, paleontology that made Darwin so successful? Why was he able to convert the scientific community in 10 years and have that last for a century and a half? And what does it mean today? The short answer I give is it's no longer relevant because his opposition has changed. That's the short answer. Part 3 is really the heart of the book, which is now that we know genetics is the most important field, now that part 2, Darwin's data are no longer relevant because the opposition has changed, creationism has matured, what does genetics actually say about the origin of species? And one of the shocking findings is genetics doesn't just tell us who's related to whom. Genetics tells us when species arose. There is a clock in us. There's a clock in species around the globe that says that ticks off time since species arose. And I argue in the book that there's evidence from genetics, and actually even evidence from Darwin's own data, that species arose recently. That is a bombshell conclusion. I've got an afterword that deals with some of the larger philosophical religious questions, because the same surveys that say 97% of scientists accept evolution have also surveyed their religious beliefs, and at least 60% don't believe in God. So there are larger questions at play. This is 10 chapters of science, and you really can't escape the afterword. Now, I wrote this book in terms of its technical level, really for more of a high school, college student. I expect PhD colleagues to read my published papers. But I've got 30 pages of detailed references because this book has to be able to withstand criticism, and I put it there mainly for the purpose of the critics without trying to bog down the text in nitty-gritty detail. So this book is really written for anyone who thinks that evolution rejects what Genesis says, who agrees with the 97%. I lay out reasons why, hey, I think it's time to rethink this issue. Look at the history of the last 150 years. Look at the advance of science. I think anyone should say this should at least deserves, let's stop and rethink this. And the rest of the book goes through, here's why I think not only should we reject what Darwin said, but there's a new model that totally replaces it. That's a controversial thesis. My appeal to anyone who disagrees with it is, give me a chance, take a look through this book. I've written it not as a sermon. I've got colleagues from my graduate days I'm sending the book to, and we teased back and forth, and they said there better be some science and not just Bible verses. It's 10 chapters of science. It's not to belittle anyone. It's to walk through the data and say, let's see what this actually says. You can get the book here in our bookstore. For our web audience, it's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can get a Kindle version through the AIG web store, and there should be a link then on the web stream here to the AIG web store that has both the hardcover and the ebook. I've also created a Facebook page for this book because my goal is to provoke discussion. This isn't a sermon to beat people over the head. This is at times to say, let's rethink this. And this will provoke a lot of questions for many people, especially in the scientific community. And I wanted to create a space where we could have this. I'm inviting criticism, and I've got a Facebook page so that this can be critiqued. People can ask questions. We can dialogue about things that I've missed. Science is a work in progress. It always is a work in progress. It was a work in progress in Darwin's day. 2017, it's no different. So why can't we have a discussion? Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you to the web audience for their attention. Hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Dr. Jensen will be out in the lobby. He can answer any of your questions. So please gather up all your possessions and exit to your left. There'll be some tracts out there by the door that you can pick up as you go. Thank you for being here.